Hello, and welcome to the Homegrown Fuels Podcast, sharing stories of ethanol's emergence in rural America. I'm your host, Sue Retka Schill, a biofuels journalist now retired from full-time work, but still writing about ethanol and other biofuels for Ethanol Producer Magazine and others. There are so many good stories out there about the early days of the ethanol movement that ought to be recorded. Writing a book takes a lot of time and resources, but I love talking to people and people love telling their story. So the idea for this podcast was born. Thanks to BBI International and Ethanol Producer Magazine for producing this podcast. My guest today is Keith Kor, who started working as an operator at a small plant in the early 1980s and worked at a couple of other interesting plants, eventually landing in Winnebago, Minnesota as plant manager and then general manager at Corn Plus. After moving to Arizona, he managed Pinal Energy in Maricopa, Arizona. Welcome to the Homegrown Fuels Podcast, Keith. How'd you get your start in ethanol back in those early 1980s?
After I got out of the military, I went to school in La Crosse, Wisconsin to be an x-ray technician. And I went there and graduated, and I was working as an x-ray tech. And then I was in a bad car accident. My knee was all shattered up. And so I was laid up for a while. And I was going to the local cafe in Houston, Minnesota. And one day I met these two guys that were building an ethanol plant. And so I asked them, I said, do you have anybody to build a building for you? Because my wife comes from a family of 12 and they were in the construction business. And they said, no, we don't. So we got a crew together and we built the ethanol plant for him. Afterwards, he said, hey, how would you like to come to work for me? And I said, I don't know anything about ethanol. He says, you ever drank any? And I said, yep. He said, good enough. So that's how I started. Anyway, I started as a shift operator, and then I worked my way up to shift supervisor, and eventually a plant manager. 500,000 gallon a year plant.
500,000?
Yeah, we had 4 10,000 gallon fermenters and a 20,000 gallon beer well, and we had a distillation column, and the everything was made out of mild steel. So you can imagine what happens within about 6 months. What happened was the trays in the beer column collapsed. We were getting pinhole leaks in the distillation column, and then one night, one of the operators called me in the middle of the night and says, "Hey, the beer well split open. We got mash going out the back door, going into the city sewer line." And previously to that, the city wastewater treatment operator guy told me that something like this ever happens, you got to come down to the plant. We have to turn a switch so it diverts it from the regular and puts it into a holding tank. I couldn't get a hold of the wastewater treatment operator, so I drove my pickup down there, jumped on the hood of my truck, and jumped over the fence and diverted it just in time. And so eventually, we had to replace the trays in the beer column, and I actually got a bid from Dave Vandergren and his brother about replacing the distillation columns. But I was there for a couple of years, and then in 1984, I went to a 2 million gallon a year plant in Elgin, Iowa, called Elgin Alcohol, and that was where a Westfall plant was, a German-made plant. And then we were there for a couple of years. And then in 1986, my family and we moved to Kingston, Jamaica, to a dehydrating plant down there where they took spent wine and other things to make ethanol. And they used benzene to break the azeotrope. So quite different. It took a while to get used to that.
Yeah. My understanding was in those early days, dehydrating ethanol was a big challenge for people because that was before molecular sieves were adapted. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, I think some of the older ones, they used benzene, but in the United States, because it can cause cancer, was really not used too much in the United States, but in some of the foreign countries, they were able to do that.
Okay.
Then in the late 1980s, I went to a place in Hopkinton, Iowa. And there in Hopkinton, they were using cheese whey. There's a Swiss Valley cheese plant across the road, and they were shipping cheese whey underneath the street to us. And we're fermenting cheese whey. And it's very difficult because cheese whey can be very contagious. You get prone to infections.
Oh, okay.
And plus we had to use a different kind of yeast called K. fragilis yeast. And so that was very temperamental too. So we had an ultraviolet thing that we run the cheese whey through to keep it sterile when we were going through the fermentation. And then we'd add, once we got it sterilized, then we'd add our K. fragilis yeast.
Wow. So those early plants, the little one in Minnesota and well, not so much the in Jamaica, but that one in Iowa, what kind of yields were they able to get? What was the process like I mean, that's in the 80s, there's been a lot of changes since then.
Yeah. Back in the days we got 10% alcohol. That was really, really something nice. Very good, And with cheese whey, you're only going to get 6 to 8% alcohol because depending on how much lactose was in there when it's converted. So you had a lot more waste to deal with than anything. And a lot of the times we ended up, farmers, we'd spread our wastewater, and because we didn't evaporate it. So,
and I suppose with cheese whey, you didn't have any solids or very, very little solids.
Yeah, very little is correct. Yep.
Interesting.
Yeah. So then what happened was about a year and a half later, Swiss Valley decided to close the plant down and move it. So then we were stuck at what do we do now for a feedstock? So we looked all over the place and we actually started using sugar waste. We used root beer barrels, gummy bears, marshmallows. We even tried Jell-O. Jell-O was a disaster. And those red and white mints that you get from Pizza Hut, we'd have them and melt them down, and we'd take them, and they come in boxes, and we'd end up we had a vat that we had hot water in, and then we'd dump the boxes in there, and then the wrappers would float to the top. We'd have a window screen, and we'd scrape off all the wrappers from it. Then we'd pump that sugar to the fermenters. So then we tried potato starch, and then we also got Willy Wonka juice.
Willy Wonka juice, okay.
Yep.
Chocolatey even?
Yeah, some of it was, and which didn't ferment very well. But they were having a problem disposing of it because their city was charging them a huge amount of money for disposing of it, and so they would actually ship it to us for free. So we use that.
Did it yield fairly well, or was there enough sugar in there to make some ethanol?
Well, it was like 8% alcohol, depending on how much sugar was in it. The Jell-O didn't work very good. It bubbled out the top of the fermenters. It was a mess. And that didn't have a whole lot of sugar either. But anyway, that was some of the things we had to go through. And I remember too, we'd get our enzymes in 5-gallon buckets from Alltech and Pierce Lyons and the Dave Kelso would come down and help us, with the fermentation. And then we'd get pallets of dry yeast because we dry pitched everything. And then in 1995, actually I was at an Alltech school, and I met Bill Wells, who worked for Delta T, and they were building that ethanol plant in Corn Plus. And he asked me if I'd come up there because they were having some problems, just give an outside perspective. So I spent a week there and looked over things and had a meeting with Keith Kor, who was the general manager of Corn Plus. And I told him, I said, here's some of the things I think that you should probably do to maybe optimize the plant. And so then Keith Kor says, hey, how would you like to come to work for me? I want you to start next week. I was living in Iowa at the time, and I said, well, Steve, I got to go home and talk to my family about it. And he said, well, can you call me tomorrow? I said, I'll give you a call in a couple of days. How's that? He said, okay, sounds good.
Yeah. So that plant in Iowa, was that the Westfall plant? Was that a pretty decently designed plant then?
Yeah, it was very nice. But everything was in bars, like the pressure was in bars, and other things were all German. So it's a little hard to get that under control. But once we had it figured out, it ran pretty good.
Okay. So you applied some of the things you learned from the German design to the one up at Corn Plus, and then you started there. What did you say it was 1990 something?
1995, it started at Corn.
1995. And Corn Plus had just been built. Okay.
Correct. It was a 15 million gallon a year plant as designed.
Uh-huh. Okay. Okay.
Yep.
I wonder if that was built as part of the Minnesota, what they called the Minnesota model, when the incentives came to help build small ethanol, 15 million gallon ethanol plants in Minnesota.
Yeah, we were thought to be one of the first ones. I know that maybe Billy up at Chippewa Valley. I think they thought
okay.
they were kind of right behind us. Anyway.
Okay, and then Heartland Fuels was right. Heartland, whatever, was right around the same time.
And then Claremont, Randy Doyle.
Yeah.
So yeah, there was some of the first ones to pioneer through there, and so within in about 6 months to a year, we had Corn Plus running at pretty good speed, and in 2001, I became the general manager.
Okay.
We changed some things. We had tried to find a way to be a low-cost producer. Gas prices were kind of going up. EDG prices were kind of staying low. And so we decided to put up some wind turbines. So we went together with John Deere and put up these wind turbines. And so we were able to lower our electrical costs down to 4 cents a kilowatt.
Oh, nice.
And so then I was talking to our electrical company, because I said our electrical costs are kind of high. So they helped us with the wind turbine as well to get some money to put together to get that going. And then we looked at how can we lower our steam costs, our energy costs, with natural gas also going up. So we decided.
Yeah, there was a period in the early 2000s where natural gas was really, really high, wasn't there?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And so we met with a engineering company out of Minneapolis, and they had what they call a fluidized bed. And so what we looked at doing was burning some of our syrup, because we were producing a lot of syrup. Our evaporators weren't working that well. So we had a lot of extra syrup. And before that, we were giving it away almost. And so we decided to take a look, and we actually burned our syrup. So we did a pilot test down, I can't remember where it was, down in Alabama or Georgia. And they actually took our syrup and they were able to burn it in a fluidized bed.
Oh.
And so we got together and we actually built the plant, and we were able to run the whole plant on this fluidized bed boiler. Once in a while, we would have to supplement a little gas, but not too much. And we were able to reduce our costs, and we also were able to reduce our carbon footprint. So we were actually got some credits for our carbon score.
Nice. What was it like in the 80s and the 90s working in those plants? Would you consider it pretty primitive these days?
Very primitive, yes. And then, to train the employees to run the plant was very, difficult.
Why do you say that?
Well, most of them are farm boys, and they're good, hard workers. But, I had to train them into what's a distillation do? What's reflux do on a rectifier, and what's a molecular sieve? How's that work, And so explaining all that, So I did a lot of training when we hired people. And then when I went to Corn Plus, they had a cook operator, then they had a fermentation operator, and they had a distillation operator. And if the distillation operator called in sick, then you had to call another distillation operator guy. So I had them start cross-training to run everything. So let's say the distillation operator didn't show up, then the cook operator would take over. They'd be running short one person, but they were able to run the whole plant. So one guy could actually run the whole plant if he had to. It's hard to do, but for safety reasons, you have to have at least two people.
At least two, yeah. So when the plant was 15 million gallons, how many employees did you have then?
We had, with office people and everything, I think we had like 32 people.
Okay, so doubling,
Because
tripling, quadrupling that, because the 100 million gallon plants these days are in the neighborhood of 50, 60 people.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So then as I retired from Corn Plus, and there's a gentleman in Maricopa, Arizona, who was had a plant built as a 50 million gallon a year plant. He came up to Corn Plus to see our wind turbines and our biomass boiler. And I gave him a tour of the place. And then I told him, I said, yeah, I'm retiring in October. I said, I actually bought a place in Arizona. And he said, oh, yeah, where? And I told him. And well, a week later, he calls me up and said, hey, when do you retire? And I said, the end of September, October 1st to be exact. So he said, well, can you come out of retirement, help me get my plant running? I said, sure. So I left Minnesota on a Friday, drove down to Arizona, and started work on a Monday.
So much for retirement.
So much for retirement. And then I ended up working for him for 9 years. And
so you went from having to deal with ethanol plants in winter in southern Minnesota gets pretty doggone cold, to Arizona heat. Tell me what that was like.
well, it's hard to keep them fermenters cool. So we didn't have as high as solids in the fermenters. So we didn't have all that heat. And then we had chillers, we had cooling towers and stuff. But yeah, it was hard, especially in the winter. I mean, summertime. But in the wintertime, boy, you could really crank it up because it's still right now it's 60 some degrees in Arizona, and so it's a good time to run an ethanol plant. The problem is that we had to get a lot of our feedstock from the Midwest, our corn. And it was costing us like 25 cents extra a bushel to get it from the Midwest to here.
Ooh.
So then we also tried local Milo, and that worked out pretty good too, but it was kind of limited, the amount of Milo that was available. So we used Milo for a couple of years. And then, of course, that's a little darker grain, and it doesn't yield quite as well as corn. And then the byproduct is kind of looks like coffee beans, kind of dark. And then, so yeah, we did that. And then 2019, I retired. And then in 2020, I got a call from a company from Israel that is producing some new yeast that they would like to introduce to the ethanol industry in the United States. So they invited me and my wife over to Israel. We went and toured their Technion, which is called their college, where the professors are. And I went and looked at their facilities, and they showed me they did do some gene mapping of the yeast. They would take some yeast that had maybe could tolerate high ethanol, and maybe one that could handle higher heat. Maybe some that weren't as tolerable to lactic acid or acetic acid. And so what they would do is they'd take a gene from one and introduce it to the other one, and then they produce a strain. And so that's what they're continuing to do. They've met with a few companies in the United States, and so we're continuing to still work on that. So yeah, so I've been doing that for the last 4 years.
Can't quite let go. So what was the highlight of your career? I mean, if you started in the 80s, that's 20, 40 some years ago. What stands out?
I think to see how much the ethanol industry has grown, and and getting all of that negative publicity from the oil companies, it's bad for you and it's going to ruin your car and all that stuff. But yeah, we've seen it continue to go through all of that, and they continue to grow. And now some of these ethanol plants, the early ones were like a co-op. And if you owned 5,000 shares, you had to bring in 5,000 bushels of corn. And so then at the end of the year, based on profits, you'd get so much back on your, how many shares you had. And then afterwards, we've seen, people getting bigger and bigger. It wasn't a 50 million, now it's a 100 million gallon plant.
Yeah.
And we've seen that a lot of it mature. A lot of these earlier plants got paid off, so they became a little more profitable. And then, I think that's probably the biggest thing we've seen. the yeast companies. The yeast can tolerate higher alcohols now, even acetic acid, lactic acid. And then you have new enzymes that, produce some protease and other things. So between the yeast and the enzymes and everything else, it's really helped the ethanol business to continue to grow and stay profitable.
Yeah, from where 8 to 10% of ethanol yields in the old days, you're now what? Plants are at 14 or better?
Yeah, yep.
Wow.
Exactly. Yeah, I know back even in the early 80s, they had these, they'd sell them to farmers, these little ethanol things that, maybe produce 100 gallons of ethanol a day or something, and it was, or even smaller than that even, because they wanted to use them in their equipment. The tractors.
Oh, okay. But in a way, some of that interest, the farmer interest, is what drove the farm country to build plants like, well, was the Houston plant built by farmers?
Yes.
It was. Okay. And you were using corn.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. And of course, Corn Plus isn't that far away from where you were at Houston. That was
Right.
built by farmers. It was cooperative. Yeah.
And back then too, corn prices were really cheap. And so the farmers really are struggling and have a hard time. So they figured if that way they could bring the corn to the ethanol plant and then get a dividend at the end of the year based on the amount of, shares they owned in the company. It's kind of a win-win.
Do you remember any of the prices, the price of corn and the price of ethanol?
The very first ethanol plant in Houston, Minnesota, our ethanol we sold to Quick Trip over in
Quick Trip. That's one of those gas stations, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Over in La Crosse, Wisconsin. And
cool.
The gentleman I sold to, his name was Larry Lease. He worked for Quick Trip, and he bought our ethanol from us.
Oh, I've run across Larry Lease before because he was pretty involved in a whole lot of things in building the ethanol business, I think.
Yep, he was, yeah.
Yeah, and he bought directly from ethanol plants. That's cool.
Yeah. I know a lot of the ones that worked at Corn Plus that were working as shift supervisors and so forth, they went on to go on to be plant managers and general managers at other ethanol plants. So sometimes back when the boom was going on, it was hard to keep people because new ethanol plants were starting up and they're offering them good money because they already had the experience. So it was hard to keep some of them sometimes.
I bet that was hard. Yeah. I
always took a personal interest in all my people because, I never, as a general manager, even I'd go down to the plant and I'd sit down with the operators and talk to them and, ask them how their family's going and how they're doing. And, even during the holidays, I'd go down there and sit down there and talk with them all and see how they're doing. And so I think it's very important as a general manager and a plant manager to, get to know your employees on a personal basis and let them know you care about them. And then, make sure you pay them well too. I mean, if they're have a yearly evaluation, and if they're doing good, then give them a raise.
Yeah. On an earlier podcast, Mike Bryan mentioned the operators and the plant personnel for innovations and things that they did to improve things. Did you experience some of that where the whole team worked to, can you give an example?
Well, I'm thinking like initially when we had that plant at Corn Plus, we had fermenters sharing a heat exchanger. What happened was you get a lot of that cross-contamination. And so we ended up, some of the guys said, well, is it possible that we could have each fermenter have its own individual heat exchanger? I know it's going to cost more money, but look what it's costing us in lost production because of infections. And so, that's one example. And so my door is always open. I told anybody in the plant, if you come up with an idea that works, we'll make sure you're taken care of. And so, as far as financial raise or whatever they did or come up with a good idea, we had suggestion boxes around the plant. So if anybody come up with a good suggestion. And so, it's a good idea to get your employees involved because you know what? They're the ones running the plant, and so take care of them.
Right, right. And you mentioned infections. I remember talking to an old timer who said he could get out of his vehicle in the morning and smell whether or not there was an infection. Was it harder in the early days? Did that improve? Or, because I understand it took a while for some, particularly the small plants, to learn how critical it was to fight to keep the infections down.
You could definitely smell like sour mash. And there's times when we had fermenters that got stuck. We only had like 6-7% alcohol. And you had to make sure that you had good agitation, good cooling. And, back in the days, some of the antibiotics were kind of expensive. And so people tried to stay away from as much as possible. But as we learned, they're very important in our fermentation process.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, 5 or 6% ethanol would be pretty bad. Pretty bad.
Pretty bad. Then what happens is you got all that sugar and you run it through your distillation column, and then you get buildup on your distillation trays because the sugar gets baked on there. And then eventually you have to take your distillation column apart and clean it. So
okay, compounding
everything, yes.
Compounding everything, yeah. I've also heard that in the early days, and I think you mentioned, we talked about it a little bit. They didn't realize the value of distillers' grains. Was that the case when you started at Corn Plus in the mid 1990s? Had they begun to use distillers' grains?
Yeah, distillers' grain. It was nice if we could sell a lot of wet cake, but there's not that many cattle farmers around. There was some, but then we had to dry it, and the distillers market wasn't that great. So we put in a pelletizing plant to pelletize the DEG, and then we are selling it for wood pellet stoves.
Oh,
we actually had 50-pound bags of pelletized DDG, and we're selling it for the wood stoves.
How did that work out?
I had a wood stove at my place, and I tried them, and they worked really good.
Oh, okay. That's interesting.
Then, of course, the DDG market came up, and so then it wasn't feasible. But we always had it available in case the market did drop. You could always go back to the DDG pellets.
Okay. I had heard it was difficult to compress and pelletize distillers' grains. Did you have issue with that, or did you have to have an additive or something?
We had an additive that can stick together. Yep. And then on the fluidized bed, we always had ash to deal with. And so we took the ash and we started pelletizing the ash, and we were selling it back to the farmers for fertilizer.
Oh, okay. If you had a pelletizer, why not? Yeah.
Yeah. So we tried many different things to try to, make the plant more profitable.
Yeah.
And then with those credits that we got, 1 year that we paid for the fluidized bed in 1 year.
Oh, that's pretty decent. Yeah.
Yeah. And then of course that program eventually faded out. So then, but yeah, it paid for itself over.
Yeah, that made it worthwhile. Was it a difficult process to manage?
Fluidized bed, you had to make sure that your syrup solids were kind of consistent, because otherwise it's hard to burn water. And so if you made sure that your solids were kept at a constant, then it ran pretty good.
Okay.
And then we had to make sure that fluidized bed was continually bubbly, going up and down. And if otherwise, what happens, you'd end up forming clinkers, and then you have to go in there with a jackhammer and jackhammer out all that clinkers out of there. That was no fun. So that was no fun.
No, that wouldn't be.
But it turned out pretty good.
All right. Well, we're about done with the allotted time. Is there any other comment you'd like to make for the Well, hopefully the young operators bored in the middle of the night listening to this podcast for something to do because it's kind of quiet around the plant in the middle of the night when you're working as an operator. Any comments?
Well, I'd like to say to
Advice?
them, you guys are the ones who really run the plant, and so keep up the good work. Look for ideas to way to improve the process. Talk to your manager about it, and let them know that I think this might help improve the process. Because no idea is a dumb idea. So whatever they can do to help improve the plant operations and make it more consistent, more power to them.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Keith. I appreciate your time. It was kind of fun talking and learning about things like the Jamaica business of using spent wine and candy in Iowa. A little bit different than the corn fermentations. Thank you much. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Sue.
Thanks to Ethanol Producer Magazine for sponsoring this episode of the Homegrown Fuels podcast. Ethanol Producer Magazine is the #1 source for ethanol industry news, trends, and statistics. Through the print magazine and website, ethanolproducer.com, the editorial team delivers daily news and industry features to an audience of producers, service providers, and vendors. If you would like to sponsor a future episode of Homegrown Fuels, contact service@bbiinternational.com. And if you have a comment on an episode or know of a story that ought to be shared, email homegrownfuels@bbiinternational.com. This podcast was recorded and edited by Danielle Pekarski, Content Manager at BBI International, and I'm your host, Sue Retka Schill. Thank you for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode of Homegrown Fuels, sharing stories of ethanol's emergence in rural America.